Hi, everyone. Alan Gilman here, TorahBytes Live. We live in a crazy world. Um, this, if we're willing to admit it, we know that living this life is something that it's just not easy. For many, it's really, really difficult. Life is so full of problems, disappointments, pain, uh, call it something bigger, suffering, broken relationships. Um, if we get honest, life can be really, really terrible. But through knowing God and understanding His Word, we have heaven's resources at our disposal to learn how to live the kind of life that God really wants us to live. Not a perfect life, but an effective life. And as I was thinking about this week's Torah Bites message, a little further to what I was going to share with you today, it was actually blowing my mind in the sense that what we have uh, through the scriptures and through what Yeshua, the Messiah, has done for us, we are actually made right with the universe. It sounds like a really big, major, esoteric thing, but what we actually have in God through the Messiah sets us in a place in the universe through which we can actually live true, meaningful, effective, good lives. And there's this particular Torah portion this week, and the thing that I focused on in my message, this that I released a couple of days ago on Tuesday, called Restoration, helps us to see how God really does that for us. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next few minutes. So this week's Torah portion is called Mezorah, and it's from Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus, chapter 14, verse 1 through chapter 15 and verse 33. And in it, we have their ritual that a person who had an infectious skin disease, traditionally, this condition was called leprosy, but my understanding is the word that's used there, that translated leprosy, refers to more than simply classic leprosy, but various kinds of infectious skin diseases. And when somebody became sick in this way, they actually had to live apart from the community and live in a special place. And if they did find themselves in a public situation, they were supposed to put their hand over their mouth and shout out, "Unclean, unclean." And so these people were outcasts in the society. And if you had an illness like this for a period of time, there must have been such a great psychological impact on the person, on the victim, as they would see themselves. And even though there's nothing in the scriptures to suggest that people who contracted these kinds of diseases did so because of anything that they had done, they were simply victims of this kind of illness. And because of the infectious possibilities of something like this, that's why they had to keep themselves apart from the rest of the society. And we learned things like quarantine and how to manage epidemics and that sort of thing from scriptures like this in the Torah, in the Bible. And so the scriptures delineate for us an idea that these people were to be set apart to keep the society safe. But you could still see, no matter, even though the Bible doesn't say that the people were bad because of this, it's common for people to think that way. And so these people must have been looked down upon, and then the people themselves must have thought really badly about themselves, and it was a horrible situation to be in. And even in our more advanced, so-called progressive society, when we find ourselves as outcasts for one reason or another, we see ourselves as not really in. We could look down on ourselves, and other people might truly look down on us, even if they say all the right words. I remember years ago, I contracted hepatitis A. Don't know how I got it. I'm fully recovered. It was many years ago. It was when we were still young parents. I was working at I was working at At some point, I was working at a daycare center. Maybe that's how I contracted it. It's possible that we had friends with young children, and that kind of illness can be carried by infants, and we may not know. Anyway, I contracted it, and I was told what I could do and what I could not do. And so as long as I wasn't shaking people's hands and having close physical contact with people, we could be in the same room, people could visit, and this sort of thing. I was able to go out in public as long as I was taking the right kind of precautions. And after about 2.5 months, I was completely better, and I'm grateful for that. But it was interesting. People wouldn't visit me. I don't mean to sound woe is me, but people who I would have had normal contact with because of they heard about the illness, they didn't want to come over. I remember getting some sort of call from, I think it was a vacuum cleaner uh, company trying to come over so I remember using the fact that I had hepatitis to put them off. Once I told them that, they didn't want to come over. I didn't bother telling them that I didn't bother telling them that it wasn't an issue, but I just use that to illustrate the fact how people could react or respond to uh, things like that. And how do you think it made me feel that friends of mine wouldn't come and visit me because of the condition that I was in? If I probably would have been in the hospital, I would have had more visitors. But woohoo, woe is me. But that's what happened, and we people it's victims are further victimized by the conditions that we have. And when I'm talking about legitimate victims, as these people who had these illnesses had, they were true victims and further victimized by how people related to them and their illness. The Torah tells us that in the case where these people would be healed and they'd get over their illnesses, there was a ritual that they were to undergo. And it was really quite something, because apart from the particular sacrifice they were supposed to make, they would go to the Kohen, the priest, and he would um, put some of the blood of the sacrifice on the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the right big toe of the person who is now healed. Now, anything to do with sacrifices sound weird to us today, um, but that's what they did. And to us, that just kind of sounds a little weird. But to them, it wouldn't have sounded weird, because they also knew that the only other people that underwent a ritual like that was when the Kohanim, the priests, were set aside for service. So the only people that had blood put on their right earlobe, their right thumb, and their right big toe were priests. And so when they underwent that ritual, what the community was saying to them, what the religious leadership was saying to them, what God was saying to them is, you are fully restored. What happened to you happened to you. Now you are better. Now you are in a healed condition, and you are now fully part of the community again. Of course, they were always part of the community, but they had to be outcasts. Now they were brought back in. And it was as if through this ceremony, God was shouting to the community, restored, restored, restored. And what a wonderful thing. I mentioned psychologically, the psychological impact of having the condition, of having to live apart from the rest of the community. And now the psychological impact of making a fuss over the person as part of them being restored. And so when we are restored, in whatever our situation is, and especially what I want to focus in is when God restores us to himself and we become part of his community of believers. And maybe somebody was already part of that community and they went astray and now they've been brought back. I think we should make a fuss. We should make a big positive fuss over people who come into an experience of restoration. We know the story It's in Luke chapter 15. There's three stories. There's the story of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, also called the prodigal son. And the setup for those stories, those parables, was the religious establishment was upset that this rabbi, Yeshua, who we learned to be the Messiah, was hanging out with people that they saw as the outcasts. Um, so he was spending time with the sinners of the society. And I say sinners because the way they thought about sinners then and the way we use the word today was different. They're actually the blue collar workers, the commoners. They were not the ones who were able to give themselves to the Jewish religion like other people were able to. And so he hung out with these kinds of folks, and the religious establishment looked down upon that. And so he told these stories, and he explained that when somebody's that the doctors come for sick people. Doctors don't have to visit the people who are well. They go after the sick. And so if you have 100 coins and you lose one, you don't make a fuss over the 99 that you didn't lose. You spend all this energy looking for the lost coin or the lost credit card. And when you find it, you get all excited and you tell everybody, the thing that I lost, I found. Same thing with the shepherd and their sheep, and then the story of the son who took half his inheritance, took off, blew all his money, was given over to ungodly living, and then realized that his father's servants were better off than he was, and he wanted to go home, and he was going to beg his father to take him back and treat him as a hired servant. And when he comes back, the father is so excited to see his son. He goes running to him, and he throws a party, gives him great clothes, and he kills the fatted calf. So the best puts on a real spread for him and throws a party for him. And so his older brother, who hears about this, is standing outside the house. He doesn't want to go in because harumph, his brother, who blew all of his money, treated his family like they were garbage. Now he's back, and now his father's making a big fuss, and his father comes out to him, which is quite interesting too. And the father doesn't wait in the house, so he goes to the son with the attitude and pleads with him, and he explains to him it's only right to make a fuss over your brother because he was lost and how he was found. He was dead, so to speak, and now he's alive. And so it's proper to make a big fuss over the return of the lost son. And we know Yeshua says that the angels of heaven rejoices over one sinner who repents. Heaven erupts. Heaven has a party when someone who's gone astray comes back. And he's telling us through all this that it's a big deal, and we should be excited over the fact when somebody returns. And so perhaps we should be making a bigger fuss in our communities over people when they're restored, because God's excited about that. And so, first of all, the idea that God is so into it, first of all, it reminds us that restoration is possible. We come into a world that's out of sorts, and we come into this world out of sorts. Now, some people feel this more than other people. Some people's lives are the evidence, the brokenness of life, and other people, not so much. I can't relate to those people so much because I grew up being really, really in touch with the mess that our world was in. Of course, when I grew up in a dysfunctional home, I thought it was just us. I didn't know how many other dysfunctional homes there were. And today, more than ever, so many broken relationships, so many kids relating to so many different parents, kids who don't know who their parents are. And it's not a nothing. People are really, really messed up. And in fact, the people who know they're messed up are better off than the people who don't know they're messed up. It's possible. Many people who aren't in touch with the brokenness of this world, it's because often, and I'm not speaking for every single person, but it's often because they're distracted by, maybe they have wealth, and they think they can buy themselves out of their problems, and or they medicate themselves, whether through legitimate or illegitimate drugs, or through the seeking after pleasure, or they're busy with work, or whatever it is. So, how many of us can stop, take inventory of our lives, and discover that we're okay? If we know the Lord, we can be okay. But even when you know the Lord, for many people, that's when the fun really starts and the trouble really starts, as we begin to follow God in doing the things that he wants us to. And then we start running into our frailties or our inability to be all that God wants us to be. But when God restores us, he makes us right with himself. Book of Romans says we have peace with God through the Messiah. And the biblical term peace, in Hebrew, it's shalom, and it means everything in its right place. And to think that in a world where so many things are out of whack, we can have peace. That doesn't mean that we're going to go through life floating on air with a sense of serenity all the time, but somehow, because of God's restoration power in our lives, because we can be forgiven, which is that's the big one. We can actually, all the things that we've done, that where we've acted out our dysfunction, we've acted out our sin, because of what Yeshua has done for us, we can be forgiven. We could be made right with God. And as you know, for us to experience God's forgiveness, we have to forgive other people their their wrongs against us. And when we do that, even with all the mess we might still find ourselves in, it puts us in this, call it a sweet spot of rightness with God, with others, and the universe. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be trouble in our lives, but we can know the presence of God and the peace of God, and a sense of meaning and worth, and that we can have the satisfaction of knowing that God wants to use us and uses us for his good in this world. So instead of groping and grasping after meaning, or many people just give up on it, we live in what seems to be the most meaningless uh, time of all history, where people believe life has no meaning. We came from nothing. We're going nowhere, and we sort of just kind of bounce around life until we die. And I think that's pretty messed up. And if you're in touch with yourself and with life at all, you know how messed up that is, because somehow, even though people are telling you life has no meaning, you know that it should. Deep down inside, you want a world with meaning. And when you come to know God through Yeshua, you have the opportunity to discover that meaning, because you can be restored to your Father in heaven, who created you and put you on earth uh, for on purpose. Um, and so it's right that we make a fuss over this restoration experience, because it's something to be really excited about, and everybody should know about it. But what if our community doesn't make a fuss? My primary community is the Jewish community that I grew up in, the first almost 20 years of my life. And coming to know Yeshua, there was fuss made, but not the fuss um, that I appreciated. There were a couple of people who were happy for me that I found something good in my life. People who were aware how broken and miserable that I was, and they were sort of kind of happy for me. There was a couple of Jewish people that were so happy they were even open to explore who Yeshua, Jesus, really was. And a couple people took a step in his direction. But for the most part, I became an outcast among my own people. And within my own extended family, I became an outcast by something that I embraced and thought of. And I understand why. I understand the dynamics in my own community, the Jewish community, why believing in Yeshua has such stigma. I get it. I grew up that way. I completely understand it. It's still sad. It's still tragic that the people who were put on this earth, my primary, my family, uh, would not applaud the great things that God had done in my life. And I and the fact is, whoever your community is, it could be your church community, your family of origin. When God gets a hold of you, they may not respond with a big party. In some believing communities, uh, they might look askance at how God has gotten hold of you and some of the things that He's doing in and through you. And some of you watching this, listening to this, understand this, that sadly, God's people don't affirm, God's people don't always affirm what God affirms. But it's so essential to remember that in spite of what people should have done, in spite of the fact that maybe they didn't throw a party for you like the father in the prodigal son story, even if they didn't do that, to know that when you were made right with God or made right with God again, when you've been restored or made or restored to Him again or again, the angels of heaven rejoiced. Your Father in heaven rejoices over you. He is so, whenever we've seen the error of our ways and we come back to God, God is so excited. And I think I could say this. Well, I know I can say it, but I trust it's true. Even when people don't fully get what God is doing in our lives, God has a way of showing us that He's really accepted us. I remember when I was first told about Yeshua when I was almost 19 years old, long time ago now, and the young man that shared the truth about Yeshua through the prophecies in the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, he told me that if I asked Yeshua into my life, if I turned from my sin and believed on Yeshua's, on His death and His resurrection, if I took a step in that direction, that God would prove Himself to me. The way he said that I would see signs. And what he was saying to me, and it excited me, because he was saying that this wasn't just going to be a psychological experience. It wasn't just going to be a club that I was going to sign up with. He was saying that there really was, that the God of the Bible was real. The God who parted the Red Sea, the God who did the 10 plagues, the God that did the other miracles in the Bible, that same God would prove Himself to me by showing wondrous acts in my direction, that I would experience this. So that took something that would at first glance be something very internal and in my mind, which is what we think spiritual things are. We think of them of something that's very intimate and personal. It does have that aspect to it. But then there's the objective outward aspects of it, without which none of this would be legitimate. I was going to say, in my opinion, but according to the Bible, God reveals Himself for people to see. Now, I know, there's some of us, insist that we have to see before we believe, and that's a different kind of problem. What this young man was saying to me was, believe and you will see. So take a step in God's direction, and God would show Himself to me. And He's done that over and over and over and over again in my life, one way or another. He hasn't made my life perfect, whatever that means. I think perfection is actually, in the way we think of perfection, I don't even think it's a legitimate notion. I don't think that kind of perfection, the way we think of perfection, actually exists. I think shalom exists, everything in its right place, that our lives, the pieces of our lives that are scattered, they're fragmented, they're broken, some of them are lost, that in our experience with God, he begins to put those pieces back together in the places where they should be, and even makes them better than before. That's something we can really experience, that we're called to experience God really, that there's um, we should experience the echo of the angels rejoicing in heaven, that heaven's thunderous applause for the person who's restored, the reverberation of that should be felt in our lives. It should be that real. And so that if God and Yeshua are just concepts to you, then there's something missing in your experience of God. Things should happen. And when I say that, I don't mean that the list of things that we sometimes insist upon, that, if God really exists, then this should happen, and this should happen, and this should happen. I'm not saying that, because one of the dynamics of truly knowing God is knowing him on his terms. He sets the terms. We don't set the terms. But if we give ourselves to him, we put ourselves at his disposal, he will act on our behalf, and things start to happen. We need to be paying attention. It needs to be on his terms. Again, we don't snap our fingers and God does whatever we want. There will still be disappointment. There'll be things that we pray for that don't come to pass. But you start praying and pray in Yeshua's name, and you put your trust in him, God will begin to act on your behalf. Because he's truly accepted us, he's made the universe, and even though the creation is broken because our first parents, Adam and Eve, rebelled against God, God always still has the upper hand in the universe, and he will work out things for our good. And if we're patient, and if we're looking and staying alert and being attentive, we'll begin to see the ways that God works for good on our behalf. Because not only can we experience restoration in him, but he wants to shout that restoration from the rooftops for everyone to see. So that's this edition for TorahBytes Live. Please feel free to comment in the comment section below. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Also, go to my website, alangilman.ca. You could sign up for my newsletter there. You'll get TorahBytes every week. You'll get other biblical articles. And you can also send me questions by email. You could send them to info@torahbytes.org. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I sound like a voicemail right now. So that's it. Until next time, this is Alan Gilman for TorahBytes Live.